Legendary arms and armor are part of the folklore of many cultures throughout the world, so it's no surprise that it also shows up in fantasy literature and fantasy games. Magic also has its share of legendary equipment. These weapons and armor are meant to represent something that there is only one of, and they're usually important to the story or belong to a character who's important to the story. And legendary equipment in Magic is pretty powerful most of the time. In all, there are 50 cards that either are legendary equipment or create legendary equipment, and more than half of them have achieved at least one top finish at Magic's highest level of competition. In this video, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Luxior, Giada's Gift. This legendary weapon is from Capenna, and it was given to Elspeth by Giada. It's infused with the essence of angels. For 1 generic, this equipment gives the equipped creature +1/+1 for each counter on it, and the equipped creature isn't a planeswalker and is a creature in addition to its other types. It can equip to a planeswalker for 1 generic, and everything else for 3 generic. Luxior is a pretty unusual equipment in its ability to equip and even animate planeswalkers, and it's pretty efficient at doing it because the equip cost is so low, but it can also offer a pretty big boost to any creature with a bunch of counters. Luxior's points have all come in modern devoted Druid decks. The Druid is a creature who can tap for green mana, and it puts a -1/-1 counter on itself to untap. There are several ways to produce infinite mana with the Druid in Modern, like by having a Vizier of Remedies in play, but Giada's Gift does the job too, since every -1/-1 counter the Druid puts on itself now also offers a buff, effectively cancelling out the effect of the counter. Luxior can be easily tutored in the deck too, which packs both Urza's Saga and Stoneforge Mystic. While Druid decks using Luxior were successful in Modern between 2022 and 2023, the release of Modern Horizons 3 had a seismic effect on the format, and so far Luxior hasn't found a new home, so it may not be on the list for long. At number 9, it's Lost Jitte. This legendary equipment was found in the Vault on Thunder Junction, and it's designed to reference an older legendary equipment from the Plane of Kamigawa. For 1 generic and an equip cost of 1, it makes it so that anytime the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you put a charge counter on the Jitte. You can remove those charge counters for a modal effect, which has 3 options. You can untap a land, you can make a creature unable to block, or you can put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature. Notably, the Jitte can use these abilities even if it isn't equipped to something, so setting in a creature that can only trade can be advantageous since you get this extra value. And these abilities are super relevant, especially when you factor in how little mana you have to spend on them. Counters and making a creature unable to block will help press an advantage, and untapping a land might help you power out something early. The Jitte has been featured in aggro decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, and it's been especially successful in decks that have an artifact sub-theme, like Simic decks in Standard, which run things like Teething Wormlet and Zoetic Glyph. Likewise, in Pioneer, it's played alongside Insult Artifact, and in Modern, it's been played in Hardened Scales decks, which like +1/+1 counters just as much as they love artifacts, so the Jitte brings some additional synergy. While the Jitte isn't really heavily played in any of those formats, the fact it's already seeing play in them certainly matters, and it's so cheap and has so much upside that it's probably not going to be done racking up top 8s anytime soon. At number 8, it's Eater of Virtue. This legendary equipment from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty doesn't really have much lore, but based on its effect, I think it's safe to say that it somehow absorbs the qualities of those who die while wielding it. For 1 generic mana and equip cost of 1, a creature equipped with the Eater gets exiled when it dies, but it also gets +2/+0, and if a card exiled with the Eater has one of Magic's evergreen keywords, the equipped creature gets those too. This is our 3rd consecutive 1 mana equipment, and like the other 2, this offers a ton of upside for a very low investment. +2/+0 is often relevant to begin with, and if your deck has lots of creatures with keywords, moving this around can feel pretty amazing. It's put up top 8s in both Standard and Pioneer aggro decks, and the latter one of the sweeter creatures to put it on was Stone Coil Serpent, since it can not only take advantage of the stats boost thanks to Trample, but Eater of Virtue will gain 3 keyword abilities if the Serpent ever dies. Eater of Virtue hasn't put up any top 8 since 2023, and it'll probably get passed by the GT in the future. At number 7, it's Halvar, God of Battle. This Kaldheim God is a modal double-faced card, which means you can choose to cast either face of it from your hand. The Halvar side is 2 generic and 2 white for a 4/4, and creatures you control that are enchanted or equipped have double strike. And at the beginning of combat, you may attach an aura or equipment attached to a creature you control to target creature you control. Halvar makes your auras and equipment way better. Double strike is a huge deal, as is equipping stuff for free, but Halvar can also just be cast as his legendary weapon, the Sword of the Realms, which is so powerful that it's capable of cutting through the World Tree. It's one of many artifacts stolen by Tybalt during the Kaldheim story. For 1 generic and a white, and an equip cost of 1 generic and a white, it gives the equipped creature +2/+0 and Vigilance, and when the equipped creature dies, you return it to its owner's hand. Halvar is kind of nice if you've got an equipment deck, because if you already have equipment in play, you'll play him as a god, but if you have equipment playoffs around already and no equipment, you can cast a sword instead. And it's also nice that you can get around the legend rule by casting it as an equipment when you need to, and vice versa. Halvar gained all of its points in standard white weenie decks, which were often packing equipment like Maul of the Skyclaves, which normally has a pretty steep cost to equip after that first equip, but Halvar helps offset that problem. Halvar hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of Standard. At number 6, it's the Irencrag. This legendary artifact from the plane of Eldraine doesn't start out as an equipment, but it can become one. It's a top-down design that's meant to represent the legend of the sword and the stone. The plane of Eldraine has its own version of that story, where knights thrust their sword into a volcanic rock, and if they can pull it back out, they are viewed as worthy, and their weapon gets powered up with magic. In other words, it becomes a legendary equipment. You can see from the art on this card that most knights don't manage to get their sword back out. Anyway, for 2 generic, it can tap for colorless, and when a legendary creature enters under your control, in other words, when you play a creature who's worthy, the Irencrag can become a legendary equipment artifact named Everflame Hero's Legacy, which offers the equipped creature +3/+3, and can be equipped for 3, and the Irencrag loses all of its other abilities. So even before it becomes a legendary equipment, the Irencrag is a pretty interesting card, because it's the first 2-mana mana rock that's been legal in Standard in a very, very long time. It offers a pretty legit mana boost for decks that are interested in that. Mana rocks do lose their usefulness the longer a game goes on, so it's nice that this one can turn into a legendary equipment, and while it's a little bit clunky to equip for sure, the buff it offers is certainly relevant. Obviously, it's less aggressive than the cards we've seen so far, as aggro decks don't normally want a mana rock, but it's been played in Standard and Pioneer mid-range and control decks, and generally in decks that have a few legendary creatures, so the legendary equipment upside is very accessible. It's in good position to continue to add to its score, but the top 5 on this list all have a pretty massive lead on the bottom 5, so it's going to take some serious work to break into the top half of the list. At number 5, it's the Reality Chip. This Kamigawa Neon Dynasty legendary equipment is a mysterious semi-sentient artifact that augments the abilities of those who implant it in themselves. It was used by the Wanderer to stabilize her spark so that she could stop accidentally planeswalking all over the place, but it turned out it had some dark connections to the Phyrexian Praetor, Jin Gitaxias. For 1 generic and a blue, this legendary equipment is also a 0/4 artifact creature that allows you to look at the top card of your library at any time. As long as it's attached to a creature, you can play lands and cast spells from the top of your library, and it has Reconfigure for 2 generic and a blue. You could pay that cost to attach it to a creature, or to unattach it and turn it back into a creature. Obviously, the chip has the capability of letting you effectively draw multiple cards a turn, and that's a big game. It didn't see any play in Standard, but it's seen plenty of play in both Pioneer and Modern. In the former, it used to be played in some decks that used Karn the Great Creator. It would hang out in the sideboard in those decks until you used Karn's -2 to grab it when you were in a situation where you really needed to outcard your opponent. Karn eventually got banned out of Pioneer though, and the chip hasn't found a new home there. However, it's seen even more play in Modern, where it's played in the equipment-focused Hammer Time deck, which is all about using pure Steel Paladin and Sigarda's Aid to equip powerful equipment for free, like Colossus Hammer. The Reality Chip is usually featured as a singleton card in the deck, one that can be grabbed by Stoneforge Mystic. Hammer Time decks have incredibly low curves, fetch lands, and lots of card draw, so it's not hard to draw a huge chunk of your deck in a turn. The reality chip is going to keep on putting up top 8s in the future, but the 4 cards in front of it are pretty active too, like the number 4 card, which is Kaldra Complete. This legendary equipment is a callback to original Mirrodin Block's legendary Kaldra equipment, which were actually the game's very first legendary equipment. When you get those in play together, you could use Helm of Kaldra's activated ability to make a 4/4 avatar creature token that would get all of that equipment attached to it. Those equipment never did anything in competitive Magic, but Kaldra Complete has. It's supposed to be the same Kaldra as is referenced by those older cards, but now it's been Phyrexianized after the plane was conquered. Turns out getting Phyrexianized made Kaldra into a much better card. For 7 generic mana, it's an indestructible legendary artifact equipment with living weapon. This means when it enters, you make a 0/0 Phyrexian Germ token and attach Kaldra Complete to it, and the equipped creature gets +5/+5 First Strike, Trample, Haste, and Indestructible, and whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a creature, you exile that creature, and it has an equip cost of 7 generic. So when you play Kaldra Complete, you effectively get a 7 mana 5/5 with all these keywords, and that type of creature is always a massive threat. It can attack right away thanks to haste, and it's impossible to block effectively because of the other keywords, and the combination of First Strike and the exile effect means most creatures don't even get a chance to damage the equipped creature. Kaldra Complete is from Modern Horizons 2, and that means the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. Kaldra Complete has seen lots of play in all 3 formats, where it's often played alongside the aforementioned Stoneforge Mystic, which can tutor it up and put it into play for 1 generic and a white, which is quite the discount for an equipment this powerful. It's also played in Modern's Hammer Time deck, which has no problem equipping Kaldra Complete for free. Kaldra Complete is just one of the most powerful equipments in the game, and if you can get around that hefty casting and or equip cost entirely, which is very doable, it becomes an absolute powerhouse. As a result, Kaldra Complete is going to continue to see play in all 3 formats. At number 3, it's Embercleave. This Eldraine legendary equipment is actually one of the swords whose wielders managed to pull it out of Irencrag, and it's a heck of a lot more powerful than Everflame is. For 4 generic and 2 red, it's got Flash, costs 1 generic less mana to cast for each attacking creature you control, attaches to target creature for free when it enters, and it gives +1/+1 Double Strike and Trample. It has an equip cost of 3 generic. This equipment is a mono-red player's dream. In a super aggressive deck, you can play this for a whole lot less than 6 mana most of the time, because you're attacking with a bunch of creatures, and then you get a free equip right away. Casting this at instant speed tends to allow your creature to win any combat it's part of while smashing in for tons of damage. It was a format-defining card in Standard, and today it still sees heavy play in Pioneer, but the 2 cards in front of it will stay ahead of it for the foreseeable future, like our number 2 card, which is Shadow Spear. This legendary equipment from Theros is the second one on the list to have been wielded by Elspeth. It's a weapon she somehow managed to retrieve from a traumatic dream while she was in the underworld. For 1 generic mana and an equip cost of 2 generic, it gives the equipped creature +1/+1 Trample and Lifelink, and it also has an activated ability that costs 1 generic, and it shuts off Hexproof and Indestructible on your opponent's creatures until end of turn. That combination of keywords is great because it makes virtually any creature far more significant, and if your creature was already good, it makes it into a must-kill threat. Lifelink can put the game completely out of reach in many matchups. From the moment it was printed in 2020, it saw heavy play in 60-card formats, and this became even more pronounced after Urza's Saga was printed in 2021. The Saga's Chapter 3 lets you tutor up an artifact with a mana value of 0 or 1, and most decks that run Urza's Saga in Modern and Legacy run a suite of cheap artifacts to grab, including a single Shadow Spear. It even sees some play in Vintage. Basically, the Spear has been played in every 60-card format it's legal in, and it's heavily played in some of them. That won't change anytime soon. However, even with all of that success, Shadow Spear is still well behind the number 1 card on the list, which is, of course, Umezawa's Jite. This legendary equipment from Kamigawa was wielded by Toshiro Umezawa. It costs 2 generic mana and equips for 2 generic, and like the other Jite, it gets charge counters when the creature deals combat damage, and you can remove charge counters for a choice between 3 effects. However, unlike Lost Jite, Umezawa's Jite gains 2 charge counters at a time, which means you can get 2 effects for every time an equipped creature deals combat damage, and the options you have are really strong too. You can remove a counter to give the equipped creature +2/+2, or give a creature -1/-1 until end of turn, or you can gain 2 life. The -1/-1 is definitely the spiciest option, as it means you can turn this equipment into an awesome removal spell, but the other 2 effects have their place too. One of the really nasty things about both GTAs is that their controller can just sit around accumulating counters and really put you in a bad spot, because they have fairly impactful effects that they can use at any time, and that's especially true of Umezawa's GT. As a result of all this power, Umezawa's GT has been a multi-format all-star, achieving success in most formats and decks that run creatures, since they are necessary to power the GT. In Block, Standard, and Extended, this meant it was primarily featured in aggro decks. The GT caused Extended to be a little too homogenous, and when the Modern format was created in 2011, the GT was put on the preemptive ban list, and it remains there today. And as a result, Modern is the only format where it doesn't have any points. However, the GT has gone on to amazing success in Legacy, where it's usually featured in decks running the aforementioned, several times, Stoneforge Mystic, since she can search up the powerful equipment whenever you think you might need it. Put simply, Umezawa's GT has an impressive competitive history and continues to be heavily played in multiple 60-card constructed formats to this very day. If you're interested in an even deeper dive on the GT, check out my video, How Good Was Umezawa's GT Actually? But suffice it to say, Umezawa's GT is one of the most powerful equipments ever, and is easily the strongest legendary equipment ever printed. Do you want to get your hands on some legendary arms and armor? If so, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, and there's almost 800 of them at this point, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.